Welcome to Hampden-Hampshire and Franklin Conservation District's joint winter workshop series on native plants. Tonight's talk is titled Managing Invasive Plants, the Why and How, and will be presented by Heidi Dollard. Heidi is a co-chair of the steering committee of the Massachusetts Pollinator Network. She works to educate gardeners and homeowners on how they can support pollinators and other beneficial wildlife while creating a beautiful and low-maintenance landscape. Heidi has a master's of science in biology and is a master gardener. She has been an enthusiastic native plant gardener for many years. Heidi was interviewed twice by local news outlets, and her garden was featured on the Fine Gardening blog. Welcome, Heidi.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to get started. And this is one of the most critical issues that we face in trying to preserve our native landscape. Unfortunately, it's not really a lot of fun, but terribly important. Oops. Okay. So this is the reason why we need to pay attention to invasive plants. They're taking over, literally taking over the real estate all around us. And they're one of the major factors in why we're seeing the number of endangered species rising in all categories: mammals, reptiles, birds, insects. The fact that invasive species are not edible by most of our native insects means that insects are losing both food and habitat, and it's insects which feed everything else: small mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and birds. So here's one example. The American bumblebee is in very steep decline. Some populations have dropped by 90% just in a generation. This is a particularly important bee for pollination and for our food supply. So we're at a critical point now. We really need to start doing something different from our landscapes from what we've been doing in the past. So let's get into the details. What is an invasive plant? It's something that is not native to our ecosystem. In other words, it arrived with European settlers, or it arrived as part of the horticultural trade in more recent years. And the definition, according to the Massachusetts law, it causes economic or environmental harm and or harm to human health. Right now, last time I looked, there were 29 plants on the Massachusetts invasive species list. In practice, what we see is they spread rapidly, very rapidly. They displace or actively harm native plants. Native plants are plants that were here before Columbus arrived, before European settlers arrived, and they are part of the food chain. They're part of the ecology. They've all been part of this complex web of ecological interactions that goes back millions of years. Things that arrived only in the past few hundred years are really not, they don't have those interactions. A lot of these plants actually do actively harm native plants. They put out something that we call secondary plant compounds. They can put out chemicals that can prevent other plants from germinating around them, so they can literally take over the ground. As I mentioned, they do not feed native insects. They're not part of the local food web. And they outcompete native flora for sun, water, nutrients, and space. So people talk sometimes about very aggressive native plants as being invasive. In fact, if we go by this strict ecological definitions, my cat is causing a ruckus here, a native plant can be aggressive, can be a pain in the neck, but they cannot be invasive. Only non-native plants can be invasive. So why are invasives so successful? And in this picture, by the way, I believe I took this picture at a conservation area in Amherst, Wentworth Farm, and I'm pretty sure every plant in this photo is invasive. And this is what a lot of our conservation areas look like. So this is why they are able to just basically invade, take over, and decimate the native landscape. A lot of them have an extended growth period. They green up early. They keep leaves late. So they're photosynthesizing, they're producing sugar, carbohydrates, which they store, which gives them a competitive advantage. A lot of them produce unbelievable numbers of seeds, hundreds of thousands of seeds. They grow really fast. Some of them are really quick. They grow very fast through roots or rhizomes. They have a suckering habit. Their ability to regrow from a tiny root or stem fragment. This is not true of all of them, but many of these invasive plants have one or more of these characteristics. They tolerate a very wide range of growing conditions, and they're especially good at quickly colonizing disturbed sites. And most of our human managed landscape is in fact a disturbed site. Our yard, a farm, a roadside. These are all a disturbed site from the point of view of a plant. Anything where the plants that are growing have been removed or even slightly displaced is an opportunity for an invasive plant to come in. A lot of them don't, they don't have any predators, nothing eats them, they don't have diseases, there's no natural controls, there's nothing, these plants are not invasive or not even sometimes aggressive in their home landscapes. It's because they are part of this balanced food web where there's insects that eat them, there's probably animals that eat them. In fact, this is really sad. Deer, our beloved white-tailed deer, which decimate so much of our gardens, mostly do not eat invasive plants. They're not used to it. They don't find the taste appealing. And so this is part of why our native plants are getting decimated, because there's a zillion deer out there. They're hungry. They're focused on the shrinking populations of native plants, leaving more real estate for the invasive plants to take over. And I mentioned some of these invasive plants produce what we call allelopathic chemicals that prevent nearby plants from growing, and sometimes nearby plants from seeds. They prevent seeds from germinating. And I already talked about the deer. So I've been talking a lot about why invasive plants are a problem, but I will summarize here. They displace native plants, effectively reducing this food supply to native animals, insects, birds, herbivores. They're not eaten by deer, huge problem. That places more browsing pressure on the dwindling native plant populations. And they don't have these complex interactions with soil microorganisms and fungus, so they disrupt even the ecology of the soil. And the net result is they are hastening the extinction of native species. And as I mentioned, farms are a prime example. I belong to a couple of different CSAs, not always at the same time. But as I walk the farms, all the hedgerows are just completely solid invasive species. And farmers are busy. They don't have time to go, dealing with the hedgerows. They're busy trying to grow food. And when we have an unused field, that is prime example. If you have a farm that ceases to be a farm and the fields go fallow, it used to be, this is what I learned in ecology 50 years ago, is that there would be what we call old field succession, and that field would get grasses and then small woody plants, and then eventually it would become a forest. That's not what happens now. these unused fields become completely invaded by things like multiflora rose, and trees are not able to compete. So the first step is to be able to identify these native plants. You have to know your enemy. So you can go to the Massachusetts, you can Google the Massachusetts invasive plant lists. There's actually two lists. The one that you really want is the invasive plant list, invasive species list. There's 69. Some of them, are not invasive everywhere in Massachusetts. They're just invasive in environments where they are particularly successful. But you really, you need to focus on the ones that are within your control. So these are the ones that I see most commonly here in Western Massachusetts: knotweed, bittersweet, multiflora rose, buckthorn, autumn olive, Asian honeysuckle, mugwort, and Japanese barberry. There's others I see. These are the ones I deal with most commonly. I have almost all of them in my yard. The only one I don't have is knotweed. There. And the key is you have to know how to identify them. So there is tons and tons of information on the internet. I really like the Connecticut Invasive Plant Working Group. The state of Maine has a really good invasives program. But one caution about Maine is that they do not have all the invasive species that we have. So there's things on our list that are not on the Maine list. But it's really useful to, oh, yeah, the prohibited plant list is the other list. So those are ones that are not permitted to be sold in Massachusetts. And just an aside here, once something goes on the prohibited plant list, it can still be sold for 5 years. The law allows nurseries to continue to sell that plant because they don't want the poor nursery owners to, to suffer any financial harm. So they give them 5 years to clear out their stock. So that's 5 years when these horrible plants are going out into the landscape. And people don't know that. They, who would have told them? How would they have found out? So it is good to also check the prohibited plant list in addition to the invasive plant list. So here's some URLs that can be helpful. But the way I learned to identify plants is I used these plant identification apps. I do also use books, and I'll talk about those. But once you focus on one and you've pulled out hundreds or thousands, you'll be able to spot them from an airplane. You'll be able to spot them from a car going 65 miles an hour. And unfortunately, once you see them, you cannot unsee them. But it's important to know what you've got in your yard that has to be dealt with. So my favorite one of these is iNaturalist. They use the same database as Seek. It's the same organization. They work differently. It's up to you. I sometimes get different results from one or the other, but and sometimes it's good to try a couple of different ones just to confirm your identification. But a lot of native plants are pretty distinctive. And to kind of the untrained eye, like multiflora rose might look like some of the wild or naturalized raspberries, but if you just really pay attention, or blackberries, you can definitely, it's pretty straightforward. But you do have to train your eye. So that's the first thing, to really learn these invasive plants and use these apps, and also books. I like this guide from Maine. I think the pictures are really good. There's also a guide from Massachusetts that I don't think is quite as good. And this is also nice because you can just download and print your own copy. I did send away for the $32 one. But either way works fine. So another clue to being able to spot invasives in the landscape is to know what to look for at different times. And now, starting now, is a really, really good time to spot a lot of them because, as I said, a lot of them leaf out early. So already I have been out in the wooded areas on my property, and I've seen the multiflora rose. The stems are bright green. The stems are green, and so they're easy to spot right now. So now would be a good time to go on invasives patrol for the multiflora rose. Also, the buckthorn starts to leaf out early. And so if you look for those green leaves and then look at the other characteristics, I often identify buckthorn by its very distinctive bark pattern. So if you look at the bark pattern now, it will help you in the summer when there's a lot more greenery around. Then come May and June, there's flowers, especially the multiflora rose. I know people love the flowers. People tell me, oh, they smell so good. Well, they do, but they are a disaster for our landscape. So, enjoy the smell while you're ripping them out, but then that's the end of them. And of course, there's several species of Asian honeysuckle. You don't need to get down to the species level. You just need to know that it's one of these Asian honeysuckles and it's got to go. In the summer, then we see berries on buckthorn, honeysuckle, and barberry. That can be really helpful. A little note about barberry berries. Turns out barberries harbor white-footed mice, which are one of the vectors for Lyme disease. And there's been recent studies that show that in areas where there's a high number of barberry plants, that the incidence of Lyme disease is much higher. And they think it's because it's such a great environment for white-footed mice. So getting rid of barberry should be a priority. And then in the fall, you'll see berries on bittersweet, buckthorn, barberry, and autumn olive. So what tools do you have at your disposal? So before I get into the list, I cannot emphasize enough that you need to do research on what methods are successful. Pretty much every plant, repeated cutting will work, but depending on the plant, that repeated could be really, could repeat like many, many times over years. Yes, people say, oh, when I cut the whatever, some of them, it does stimulate, particularly vining plants. It does stimulate them to put out a new flush of growth. But every time they put out that new flush of growth, they're using up the stored carbohydrates that they've socked away in their roots. And if you cut away their leaves, they can't make any more. So repeated cutting will work, but depending on how much sugar the plant can store in its roots, you may be cutting again and again and again and again. But, if you really want to be herbicide free, that's the way to go. And actually with knotweed, I think it is the best way. I think it's better than using herbicides. There are some herbicides that are effective, but I personally would prefer not to use herbicides unless I absolutely had to. And then when I do, I use the absolute tiniest amount. So here are some of the methods. There's the carbon deprivation, which is, Works for everything, just may take incredible persistence. Some things you can smother with cardboard and or with wood chips or with heavy plastic. There's pulling, grubbing, digging. Cut and paint with herbicide is very popular with people who are fanatic about this. If you can find some website, Facebook pages about fighting invasives, and people really get into it. It's like they just get addicted to it, and it's kind of fun sometimes to read some of their posts. But this cut and paint method is one I use in my own property, and I think it's safe because you use just a tiny, tiny amount of herbicide. So the active ingredient that I use on the woody plants is triclopyr. It is in two of the commercial preparations are brush tox and garlon. Some people use repeated tilling. I personally think that is not a good idea because especially with something that regenerates from the roots, you're chopping up the roots and you're creating lots and lots of little plantlets. And you would have to repeat that many, many, many times to actually eliminate the plant. In the meantime, you've really destroyed the soil structure. Goats or sheep can be really effective, but they are basically an easy way of doing carbohydrate deprivation because they excuse me, chew to the soil line, but they're not going to be digging up the roots. So then something else needs to be done. Um, but they can allow you to get, sorry, a head start on a very bad situation. And then what the professionals generally use is foliar herbicides, which I personally am not comfortable with because that's putting a huge amount of herbicides out into the environment. But there's some situations where there's really no alternative. I visited as part of a walk sponsored by the Worcester Conservation District, and they were showing a huge project where a fairly well-to-do landowner had bought a farm which had not been farmed for some years, and the fields had been completely taken over by multiflora rose, and it was, there was very little else there. And they wanted to restore it to being bird habitat, and they were able to get some grants, and I think they were matching grants. They kicked in a lot of money themselves. And they hired professionals, and it was repeated foliar spraying over a couple of years, and it was effective. They did restore the native plants, and it was beautiful. But it was sad to think of all that stuff that was killed that didn't have to be killed had the previous owners been responsible and just dealt with the multiflora rose before it was acres and acres and acres. There's also controlled burns, which can be very effective for some species, but that is not something you can do on your own. It probably needs professional involvement, and you would certainly need special licenses, but depending on the situation, that might work for you. So the moral of the story is identify the plant, research the best method, and follow that prescription. Okay, you've been cutting and cutting and cutting, grubbing, digging. What are you going to do with all this stuff? So again, research will tell you what parts will resprout or grow. Bittersweet is legendary. You don't want to just throw the roots back on the ground because they will resprout. They will, winkle their way back into the ground, and you'll have another plant, which is not helpful. You can burn the remains. I think some people get a lot of emotional satisfaction over burning a giant pile of bittersweet. It's not really necessary. If you can leave any of these things out to dry on the asphalt or a tarp till they're nice and crunchy. Then you can just, you know, put them in an unused corner of your property. If it's soft material, you can then compost it if it's well and truly dried out and dead. So if you want to be sure, if you want to kill the seeds, the bag and bake is a very good method. But you can't do that for a huge amount of plant material. But if you have an afternoon's worth, you may be able to put them, maybe a sufficient appropriate quantity for putting in black plastic and leaving that material in the black plastic in a very sunny spot, preferably on a black driveway. And pretty much all seeds are killed at 140 degrees Fahrenheit. But don't compost seeds. Don't compost any living material. Make sure it's good and dead. If you have a really big area, you can leave in place non-viable plant parts, that can't resprout. Or if you have a huge amount of bittersweet and you've just gone in with a weed whacker, you don't need it. There's no way you could get all those seeds, so don't even bother. There was a lot of contradictory information about whether knotweed could resprout from the stem. And I believe I now have an authoritative answer. It can't. So if you have knotweed, go ahead, mow it down to the ground, and just leave all of the above ground parts to dry out on the soil surface. They won't resprout. They will resprout by little pieces of root, though. And I think that happens sometimes when you get the DPW coming around with their giant mowing machines, and some of those blades pull up pieces of the root, and then they're redistributed farther down the road. And I think that's where the advice to not mow comes from. But if your machine is not pulling up some plants by the root, then and transporting them, then you can go ahead and mow. So I've talked a bit about Japanese knotweed. It does spread rapidly from underground rhizomes, and once it takes over, nothing else. It just excludes every other possible plant. It especially loves wetlands and waterways, and it's really a problem when it gets to the head of a stream, because then any kind of little bit of erosion will carry those rootlets downstream and the entire stream, and then eventually, the entire water system will become completely choked. And as I said, it excludes all else. So it basically kills the ecology of a stream. It's really, really bad news. But on the good side, here in at least North America, for whatever reason, I don't know why, we only have female plants. So it does not set seed. It only spreads by rootlets and rhizomes. So that's an advantage that we have. So once you've rid yourselves of a patch, you don't have to worry about birds coming and eating the seeds and spreading, which is certainly the case of barberry and bittersweet and all those other things that have berries, because the birds just spread them like crazy. So we have a good chance of really getting the knotweed under control. So the best advice is to repeated cutting at the soil line at least 3 times a year. What I've been told is Memorial Day, 4th of July, and Labor Day. But anytime you want to cut more, it's all to the good. I do know people who have eliminated a patch by mowing it every time they mow their lawn. So bittersweet, horrible, horrible, horrible plant. It just gives me a stomach ache whenever I think about it. It's really just in the past few years, its numbers have exploded. and it kills trees. And we need trees. Trees feed, they have a huge amount of biomass. So they're feeding huge numbers of insects, particularly caterpillars. And caterpillars are what feed baby birds. That's one reason why our bird population is plummeting, is because our caterpillar population is plummeting. Baby birds, for the most part, there's a few species that are an exception. They need to eat caterpillars. No caterpillars, no baby birds. And so those trees are really important, and they're being completely smothered by these bittersweet vines. If you drive along 91 going up to Vermont, miles and miles of solid bittersweet, and the trees underneath them are doomed. They're only going to be there another couple of years. And they're all going to, they're just going to fall from the weight of the vines, or the weight of the vines plus snow. And no seedlings, no tree seedlings can grow underneath that blanket of bittersweet. So it's just a ecological disaster. They're pretty easy to identify. One thing that's a little bit confusing is that the leaves change shape as the vine matures. So you can't always go by leaf shape, but they have very distinctive orange roots. So if you're out there pulling, you've gotten the right plant when you pull something up with orange roots. There's nothing else out there with orange roots. So I think the most effective thing is to cut the vines at soil level, and then cut and paint the cut stem. So if you're not going to be using the herbicide, you will see a flush of new growth, but just persist. Just cut it down again and again and again. And again, make sure that the seeds and roots are dead before disposing them in any place where they could resprout. Multiflora rose, yes, spreads rapidly, takes over fallow fields. It will grow as vines up trees given the opportunity, so it is also a tree killer. It does spread rosette disease. I wish that I don't know if you've heard about this, but this is a relatively new disease that is really threatening ornamental roses, imported ornamental roses. You'll see that there's kind of like this cluster of deformed growth at the tip of a vine. That's the rosette that they're talking about. Unfortunately, it does not seem to be killing the multiflora rose quickly enough, but it is spreading to, ornamental roses. So again, I am an advocate of the cut and paint. There's so much out there, so many invasive plants out there. I think it's a good compromise between efficiency and putting, poisons out into the environment. But small plants are pretty easy to pull. I have purchased a pair. I should have brought them with me so I could show them. These really, really thick rubber gloves that are thorn proof. And so that's when I'm focusing on multiflora rose. I use that so I can just grab the plant and pull it out and not worry about hurting my hands, because regular garden gloves are not, the thorns will go right through them. Glossy buckthorn is everywhere. It is just, I see walls of it in the conservation areas where I walk. It's just incredibly prolific, because I pull it and pull it and pull it, and I'll come back a year later and the area will be just full of these buckthorn seedlings. It's a shrub or small tree. It does have glossy leaves, forms very dense stands. Pulling small plants is pretty easy. It's easy to pull if they're small, but once they get a little growth on them, then you're back to cutting and painting. And so that's one of the what one of the themes is that if you can get after these plants, when they're small, they're so much easier to deal with. It's so much easier just to yank out a seedling than it is to go through and cut and paint and cut and paint, which is, it's a lot of bending over. It's people in my demographic, that's a hard day's work. Autumn olive is everywhere also. It does prefer open fields. It's another thing that I've seen take over some fallow fields. Enormous seed production. And of course, birds eat the seeds and spread it everywhere. It is similar to Russian olive, which is also invasive. So don't bother telling the difference. If you've got one of them, get rid of it. And again, pull small plants, cut repeatedly, cut and paint. Mugwort is a herbaceous plant, but it is a perennial and it is incredibly tough. If you have a meadow, if you're one of these people that are thinking or have already replaced your lawn with a meadow, this could be something you really need to keep an eye out for. It is, if you look at the lower picture, it looks a little bit like a chrysanthemum leaf, and it's also kind of silvery. But then as it gets taller, the leaves change their shape. So a lot of people have been fooled. A lot of people, I deal with a lot of, I help maintain the Hitchcock garden, the Hitchcock native plant garden, and I deal with a lot of very experienced gardeners. And because of this, the fact that they change their leaf shape, they look so different from a young plant to a mature plant. People are fooled. So this is something where you really do have to train your eye. But they can rapidly take over a meadow. So if you are establishing a meadow, just patrol for mugwort assiduously, because it spreads by seeds. There's nothing you can do to prevent it. You just have to deal with it once you see some seedlings pop up. Pollen can be an allergen. It is wind pollinated. So its pollen is on the wind. Now, smothering, this is one thing where smothering is effective, but that you can only smother if you have pretty much a solid stand or, a majority mugwort area. So you cut it to the ground as close as you can to the soil. You cover it with a thick layer of cardboard, making sure there's no little chinks in there. And then you put on a really deep layer of wood chips. I've heard you can use wood chips without the cardboard, but unless you're dealing with a huge area, I really recommend both together. And if you leave that for a year, you probably will have killed most of it. I've done that, and I've seen in areas where the roots were just like monsters. When I was pulling them up, I thought, is this like tree roots? And then I traced them to the source, and they were mugwort, like huge, thick roots. So in a situation like that, you will see sprouting, but that the plant will have weakened enough that you can, if you just keep after it with pulling, you'll get ahead of it. And I've already talked about a little bit about Japanese barberry. The berries are very distinctive. The foliage is often red, and I've talked about how Lyme disease is more common because it shelters white-footed mice. So pull small plants, cut repeatedly, cut and paste. Asian honeysuckles. People tell me I get this. This pops up in my yard. I pull it out, but apparently really mature stands are especially tough. This is what people have told me. It is also possible to grub these out completely. These are not quite as they don't spread really by suckering as much as some of the other plants do. So it might be a good plan to just try to completely grub out the roots. These are beloved ornamental plants, which there's a good chance that you have in your yard. And sad to say, the responsible thing is to get rid of them. When I tell people burning bush is invasive, they get very sad and they're in denial or they're resistant because they love their burning bush and it is a beautiful plant, but it takes over woodlands. There is one area near where I live where you can see, it's here in this lower picture, you may not notice that the entire understory is burning bush until the fall when it changes color. And then you'll see the understory is pink. And you'll know that that understory is 100% burning bush. And it's because it came from a neighboring yard where people had planted ornamental burning bush. So the responsible thing, as sad as it is, as pretty as it is, it's got to go. Norway maples, that's a really tough one because some of these trees are huge and majestic, and cutting them down is really, really expensive. It is the recommended thing, but at the very least, if you can keep seedlings from sprouting in your yard. And Bradford pear is something else that I recommend that you just cut down and put something better in its place. I drive to North Carolina most springs to visit my daughter, and I see miles and miles and miles of Bradford pear. You can see it in the spring because it's blooming. It takes over square miles of unused fields, of fallow fields. And I know it's a beautiful plant. People love it as a street tree. But it's ecologically a disaster. And the same thing with tree of heaven. It's pretty, but it's just too too aggressive, too vigorous, and it takes over, especially in the eastern part of the state. Much of the highways are just lined with tree of heaven. So this is what the Connecticut Invasive Plant Management they recommend that these are the ideal times to address invasive species. And you can go to their website and you can see that, what the flowering period is, what the best time to apply chemicals is. And if you're going to use chemicals, you really need to know when they will be effective. You do not want to be putting chemicals out into the environment unless they're going to work. Otherwise, you're just poisoning the stuff around it and killing all kinds of insects and microorganisms for no reason. So this is helpful. But when it comes to some things like mechanically cutting and pulling or mowing, whenever the spirit moves you is the best time. Just do it. Many of our landscapes are just so infested, that complete management is not possible. So we have to take a triage approach. So, as I said, choose the best method to minimize effort and maximize results and minimize harm to the surrounding landscape. Prioritize saving trees, especially oaks, because oaks feed more caterpillars than any other genus. So if you see any vines, and actually I also cut the native grapevines out of my trees because they can pull down trees too. So save trees, that's, very, very high on the priority list. If you have a large property, choose a section to try to keep under control. You may not be able to do the whole thing. Cutting plants at flowering, so at least they don't set seed, can at least prevent them from spreading and prevent them from forming another generation. Make sure that you mow unused fields in May before all those things set seed, like the mugwort. Again, dispose of remains appropriately. If you miss the optimum time, well, except for chemicals, you want to use the chemicals at the right time. But cutting, grubbing, mowing, go for it. So build on your success. You're going to, the first few times you go through an area, you might get discouraged because it keeps coming back and coming back. But if you persist, you will triumph. You will keep it clear, but you can't just walk away because all these things have ways of returning, mostly from birds replanting the seeds. So new plants will always be appearing, but it's, as I said, once you're just dealing with seedlings, life gets a lot easier. Okay, you've cleared an area. Now what? Okay, something will come back. What comes back depends on the seed bank. So you may not know what's in the seed bank. It could be wonderful native plants. It could be more horrible invasive plants. Some invasives will almost certainly return. So you could take kind of a wait and see approach, but don't wait too long because once you see those invasives, you need to keep right on it. But I've heard a lot of stories from people who say, there was a lot of native seeds and native plants came back just from the seed bank. Do what you can to encourage tree seedlings in hedgerows and woodland areas. That's so important to make sure that as our mature trees are dying, new young trees are taking their place. And there are some very tough, aggressive native plants that can really outcompete. This is a picture of obedient plant, which can, in the right place, can just be incredibly tough. Another thing is a lot of the heleniums that grow on, they're native, very tall, very vigorous native sunflowers planted along a woodland edge could outcompete bittersweet. So you can use this for, I hope this still works, for native plant resources. And thank you. And your kids will thank you. The next generation of land stewards will thank you. And all of the little critters who need things to eat and places to live because they're really struggling to survive. And they will also thank you.